This podcast is hosted by Sheza Barbour, co-founder of Good Tree Institute, and joined by licensed therapist Archie Aquino and our resident scholar and founder, Dr. Nadia Qatranji.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Timeless Conversations with Good Tree Institute. So in our last episode, we discussed how Prophet Yusuf and the wife of the Aziz were tested. They were tested by desire. And this showcases how this is a real dilemma and how Yusuf was able to overcome and deal with this challenge. In the last episode, we also just addressed in generality how to overcome these challenges. But today we want to delve into how do we specifically deal with these issues. And our guest, Imam Omar Tawil, our Imam from ICC in Tempe, Arizona, has had a lot of experience helping people navigate these challenges and how to overcome these tests, especially in today's environment, in today's context. So I wanted to start off with welcoming you, Imam Omar. We're really
Assalamu alaikum.
grateful. Walaikum
Walaikum
salam.
salam.
We are so grateful for having you here and sharing with us and the audience your advice. So just to kick us off, Imam Omar, what are you seeing as the kinds of desires and challenges people are dealing with today when it comes to being tested with sexual desires in general?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thumma as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulihil amin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I see, in the Muslim community, I don't think it's really changed much over the years. I think what's changed over the centuries and over the millennia has been access to these desires and how readily available it all is from your fingertips, whereas historically people had to go and seek things and find things and make something available to themselves that maybe wasn't so readily available as it is today. And that's where the biggest challenge lies, is that number one, there's so much sexualization of everything, right? You can't go through a commercial break without something being sexualized. You can't go on a stretch of a highway without seeing billboards. And even just, the general culture of people's dress and people's behavior around one another, let alone what they see on screens or what they see in images or what they see on billboards, but just even the way people interact with one another. Access is not so difficult. Access is readily available for anyone who seeks it. Access can be done in, privacy of one's home or, at any point that one wants. And it's basically free for the taker. So that's, I think, the biggest thing that has changed, even from the context of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salatu wassalam, or even throughout history, is that access has always been one of the biggest obstacles for many peoples historically. Whereas today, access is not a problem. Access is very readily available for everyone. And I think access to insert temptation is probably the biggest problem that we're facing. And this access is also now leading to an earlier and earlier exposure. So there are people who are not necessarily tempted with these things, but they're exposed to them at a very young age. And then that creates a much more difficult scenario for an adult young man or an adult young woman to be in when they've already been exposed to things at a much younger age.
True.
So it's going to be, I think the biggest battle is going to be on exposure and access. And then I see people having addictions or having, very, very strong temptations towards a plethora, an array of different things.
So before we get into that other aspect, thank you. That's a great point. What any things that have helped that you've asked people, told people, advised people to limit that access and exposure, especially when you're talking about young age?
Yeah, one of the greatest things that I've seen that has had I guess you say, when it comes to someone helping themselves, at least, right? There's going to be degrees. There's, and there's multiple layers to it. It obviously begins with, our tawbah, right? We recognize the wrong that we've done. We recognize the sin that we are in. And, it begins with dua. We're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this tawfiq, this success. We're asking him for strength and for inspiration to actually want to change, to return to him. So that's where I always begin, alhamdulillah. And where I take them afterwards is going to differ from person to person and circumstance to circumstance, but generally it will revolve around the systems that they have in their life. The same way that we try to change our habits. If I have certain things that are constantly triggering me or allowing me to be in a place where I can be triggered and I can do whatever I want because I'm not getting it caught, or I'm going to be, I'm going to have the privacy to indulge, then it's going to be some system that's going to have to change. Sometimes, that could be involving family. Sometimes that could be involving friends. Sometimes it could even involve colleagues, interestingly enough. Generally people who are close to you, and then certain habits that one has that make it possible for them. It makes it possible for them to indulge. It makes it possible for them to feed an addiction or to feed into a temptation more than it would be if we just changed this one thing or tweaked this one thing here in their day-to-day routine. So that's going to be a big one, is changing certain habits or changing certain systems that bring one into that space. They trigger them.
Yeah, that makes it easier, right? Because a lot of the times we feel that we're just like, as they always say, if you want to lose weight and you make it easier on yourself and don't bring cookies to the house, right? Just like
Yeah.
create a system, be aware of what triggers you and stop that trigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's honestly one of the, when after the dua and after the prayer and after the seeking of repentance, that's usually the most difficult thing, but also one of the most fruitful things, because
That's true.
sometimes there's even resistance. People are like, no, I don't need to change. I can change whenever I want. I can change whatever. But when they finally admit that certain habits and certain systems around them need to change, you generally see an explosion of progress.
Exactly.
And that's really something that I've really seen over and over again, because I run into a lot of people who, they admit the sin, they know it's a problem, but they still pretend to be in control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They pretend that they can quit whenever they want. They pretend that they can stop it whenever they want to get serious. Some people will say, when marriage, when children, when this certain goal in my life happens, or if it ever becomes a real problem. And I'm like, "Akhi, it is a real problem, sister. It is a real problem. What do you mean?" And then they're like, no, it's manageable. I just feel guilt and I feel shame, and I do want to quit. I do want to stop. I recognize it's wrong, but it's not that big of a deal. And sometimes I have to have like a reality check in the same conversation. I'm like, are we having the same conversation? Are we talking about the same thing here? It doesn't seem like you're in control. It doesn't seem like there's no problem. It seems like there's a very big problem, and you're kind of ignoring it right now. You're trying to belittle it. But once we get over that hump of making it not to be something that is that big of an issue, or where they try to convince me and convince themselves that they're in control, they can really stop whenever they want, that's where we see the most change and the most progress, is once they admit, I have lost control. I feel the shame. I feel the guilt. I know my deen is against this. I know that this is a problem, but not a problem enough where I need to admit that I need to regain control. Once we get across that threshold, it's a lot easier, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, I
think
mean, it seems like people don't recognize that this is even an addiction, like any other addiction to drugs or
It's
alcohol or
it's the
something like
same.
that.
It's the same thing as anything else. Someone who's
Yeah,
addicted to cigarettes, I can quit whenever I want.
right.
I'm powerful.
When I get
I
married, when my wife or husband doesn't want me, doesn't
exactly,
like
like,
this, when I have
I had a
kids,
friend of
it's the
mine.
same.
I think I've had maybe two people that I've seen in my years who I can genuinely say that they had a strong enough, you know, coming to Allah moment where they were able to quit then and there. And both of them, it was when they had daughters, not sons. I don't know what it is.
That's what
subhanallah.
it is. That's
They're still
funny.
smoking when they had a son. But then literally, and both of them, these two friends of mine had the same exact story. They said, I lit a cigarette on the balcony and some of the smoke blew into the house, or the patio, and some of the smoke blew into the house, and my daughter started coughing. And then they were like, oh, this is so messed up.
Oh,
I have to change. I had a son before, or I had kids before, and I didn't.
Yeah.
But now's the point. And then cold turkey.
yeah.
But this is out of hundreds This is
That's
out
true.
of thousands of people that I've seen who've overcome smoking. So this is truly an exception, but everyone thinks they're a part of that exception.
Mm.
I am that 1 in 1,000. I was like, no, you're not. Those are
Everyone's
inspiring cases.
exceptional.
Yeah, it's exactly like the guy who comes to me like, Sheikh, I met this girl and she's totally different. I'm like, dude, stop it. And I'm just like, same thing with the girls. They're like, Sheikh, I met this man. He's totally different. I'm like, yeah,
Yeah,
fine.
whatever.
Yeah,
Everyone thinks that they have that romantic story or that truly exceptional,
so true.
inspiring episode that will change the course of so many other people's lives. I'm like, let's be humble. We're not
Totally.
exceptional. We're in a struggle. Let's just identify with that.
That's
We're
so
in a
beautiful.
struggle of power. We're in a struggle of control. Let's start there. So,
That's
I tell people, yes, these examples that you're thinking of or that you've heard of are truly inspirational, and they've happened. I know of 2 cases, but I know of hundreds where it took a lot more work.
Hmm.
yeah.
And that's just with something like smoking. Now, what about with things like porn addiction or sex addiction or alcoholism or other drug substance addictions, or heck, even addiction to looking?
Yeah.
Right.
Again, because everything is so accessible that we've kind of even forgotten that if I have no problem looking away from a screen, even though it's like a lighter issue, like what's on public television or what's in PG-13 movies,
Hmm.
like just because I don't look away from that stuff, well, guess what that translates to? I'm not going to look away in real life.
True.
And there are even brothers who's like, look, I can't even look away when I'm at the masjid. I'm like, this doesn't need work at the masjid. This needs work in your daily life. So there's this idea of, you know, we have every kind of addiction that exists outside of the Muslim community exists inside the
Hmm.
Muslim community. But
Exactly.
it's the discourse. It really, at the end of the day, comes down to urgency based on whether or not one is in control.
Yeah. And I just want to highlight something very important to the human nature that you highlighted, that you addressed, which is the transition from something that you start liking and you do randomly and it seeps into becoming an addiction without us noticing, just because we're not aware of how habitual of beings we are. And
Yeah,
especially at the time that we are in right now, almost everybody has habitual addictions. It's kind of like ranks from something that's kind of like okay, but really starts interfering into your life, to something that's really disruptive and dysfunctional and like haram or things like that. So I think the most important aspect that you're first highlighting, which is much easier than getting into dealing with addiction later on, is to catch yourself and be aware. Always ask yourself that question: is this an addictive thing? And of course, if it's wrong, you have to deal with it right away. But it's much easier to deal with something wrong right away before it comes into something that's habitual. Ask
hmm,
yourself, like, am I doing this on a weekly basis? Am I doing this on a daily basis? Is this something that anytime that I'm comfortable, I just want to go to? Anytime that I want to relax, I go to. These are alarming points that you have to catch yourself. It's much easier to do it then. And then what you said is to put the structure of stopping this for yourself. Like,
yeah.
wean yourself for a month. Wean yourself for a month and don't do that. It's much faster, much easier than when actually it becomes something that you're not aware of, that actually you're addicted to. Now, the first step to what you said is okay, you have to admit that you're addicted, which is, I agree with you 100%. It's the hardest part. Admit that you're addicted. And then what?
Yeah, I mean, this even gets into a problem. I'd probably say, again, it's very exceptional for someone to come to me early enough seeking help.
Right?
Hmm.
Right?
It's already done.
That's
Yeah.
even the other part. I'd say a vast majority of people come to me when they've felt that they've hit like a spiritual and emotional rock bottom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is like their I think part of it is because the Muslim community is very private about, a lot of things, very conservative. So they really view this as a huge issue of reputation, honor, right? And they don't want. And there's a lot of trust issues in the Muslim community.
True.
The house visits that I have to make are largely surrounded by people who don't even want to be seen getting help in the masjid. It's like, I can't even let people know that I'm walking into the Imam's office. Can you come visit me in my home? And I'm like, well, I don't know you, so no, I'm not
Yeah.
coming to your house. How about I meet you a couple of times in the masjid and we can make it look like a casual conversation. And then if I feel comfortable and I've asked people if they, know you and I see you're not an axe murderer, I'll come over. Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but it happens a lot. Like there are people who even communicate with the masjid or they reach out to me and it's the first time ever. I don't know who these people are. They've never met me. I've never met them. But the issue of privacy is all usually forefront. It's at the top of the conversation. But one thing that I've definitely noticed is that it's a very rare exception where someone comes to me before an addiction really takes hold. And
Yeah, and I
there's been a few young men and young women who were like, Sheikh Omar, man, I just got exposed to this. I love it. And it's a problem. How do I not let this snowball down the hill?
yeah.
Right? And I'm like, man, you got to cut the head of the snake. How did you get introduced to this? Where are you doing it? Where is it taking place? How is it taking place? What's leading you down this path? What triggers you? And I ask all of these, again, systematic questions of what, obviously what is it, but where is it happening? How and when and why? And what are you doing before and what are you doing after? And how can we really change while your neuroplasticity of your brain is still like you can still control it. It hasn't like ossified into something else. So rarely do people come to me asking, hey, before I get too deep into this, how do
Yeah.
I go back, or how do I regain the reins and have control over myself? A vast majority, it's Sheikh, I've been here for the last 8 months.
Yeah.
I've been involved in this for the last few years, and
So I
I'm
guess
at a low point. Yeah.
so I guess the biggest message that you're sending right now is just don't wait. Don't
Never,
wait. Yeah.
never. The longer one waits, the
Yeah.
more difficult it becomes. And I've shared examples, various ones. I think the two most belittled addictions that young men and young women are getting into revolves around smoking and what they see on a screen. Right? It's pornography and smoking cigarettes or smoking weed or vaping and all these other various forms of smoking. Those are the two ones that people like for smoking. It's makruh, sheikh. I'm like, you fine. If Allah hates it, why are you doing it? Like, is this the level of our spiritual connection with God? Is that I will be totally okay with doing the things that Allah hates, that God hates. And I try to even show them sometimes the ridiculous and even thinking that that's a valid excuse or a valid way of thinking. But I don't know why, but with something as heavily as addictive as nicotine, whether it's in hookah or in cigarettes or other tobacco products, or even smoking weed, which I know doesn't have like a physical capacity of getting addicted, but there's like this, I guess you say, psychology that you get accustomed to. There's like a culture of weed where it's like, yeah, man, this is part of my routine.
Right.
Like instead
Or and
of
this is
getting
how I
addicted to
wind
salah,
down.
yeah, this is how I wind down. Instead of using salah or dhikr to wind down, now it's weed is our spiritual gateway to
Yeah.
everything in life. And it's like, is this where we want to be as people, as believers? So I've seen, most men and women saying that they're under control in two areas: anything related to smoking and pornography. I'm in control.
Yeah.
And
And I did want to ask you, Imam Omar, because I mean, it was something that we thought was interesting. We noticed in the surah is that usually when we discuss Surah Yusuf, we tend to focus on the aspect that, Sayyidina Yusuf was young, right? But the other side of it is that the wife of the Aziz is an adult. So, like these problems of sexual desires or these challenges, it's not just a youth problem. This is it's whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're whatever. Like these are just challenges that I feel like everyone faces. It's not just relegated to, oh, these are the challenges of being a young and Muslim adult, in our
yeah,
society. And I wanted to see, like, are you seeing the same thing as well? Like with these addictions, it's not just a youth addiction. It's
it's
also.
It's a
It's
lot more
rampant.
complicated for a lot of the older people in the community, especially those who were not born in the U.S. It's very rare that someone comes forward, and sometimes when I'm doing marriage counseling or mediating between a couple, I usually have to have a separate conversation with the man because I can see something in that dynamic of the relationship where I'm like, can I have a talk with you privately, just man to man? You know, I don't, and because I don't want to expose someone in front of their spouse if I sense that
Mm.
there's something there that their spouse is, from what I can tell in the conversation, just completely oblivious to. And I'd say 9 out of 10 times I'm correct in my assessment
Wow.
that where there's a marriage issue that I'm working with them, and I notice that there's other issues. One of them is intimacy. I have a private conversation with the man. I'm like, "Are you doing X, Y, and Z?" And then they have like this 1,000 yard. They're like, "How did you know?" And I'm like, "Actually, like, you have to get control. You want to regain the beauty of your relationship. This is going to be one of the biggest hindrances. This is going to be one of the biggest barriers to you and your relationship. So it's very rare to see, the older immigrant Muslim community. There is some of the younger immigrant Muslim community who are maybe Gen X or Gen Z that are very open to it. Very rarely millennials who are open to seeking help with this issue. But the issue is there. It's just that sometimes I
Pull it
have
up.
to uncover it when I'm in a place to even strike up a conversation that would lead me to that. Okay, I'm sensing something, and then I have to ask them a question privately. But yeah, a lot of times there is a lot more of a shame, and I'll handle it
Mm-hmm.
myself, and this isn't a problem, and a variety of excuses to not seeking help.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there is a generational thing where it's not about who's doing what; it's about who's doing what about it.
Yeah.
The younger people, I will say, and I guess this is a point of an accomplishment to show that the Muslim community is largely becoming more aware of how to handle these
Mm-hmm.
issues. They're seeking more help.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the Imam, myself, I have to recognize when I'm out of depth, and I have to push them towards professionals who
Yep.
can dedicate real time. Sometimes there are people who are stubborn enough to say, no, I want to talk to the Imam, and I use what skills I have and what tools I have available to me to help them, battle these addictions, and try to even use some Islamic principles to keep them accountable. Or like Islamic, even creative ways of trying to put taqwa and inject taqwa into these different spaces. But it's nice to see. It's nice to see, but it's not a youth problem. It's an adult problem. It's an elderly problem. It's about who's coming forward seeking help.
And again, one more point to highlight from what you said. I just don't want it to let go without addressing the aspect of being willing to stay in our guilt and our shame, and thinking that it's fine, despite the fact that this is not the prophetic way. This is not Allah's way. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that we are going to fall, and the way to deal with it is to actually, the prophet, the companions of the prophet, peace be upon him, were very, very bold in this aspect. This is the traditional, this is our tradition, to go and just go forth and put that out there. They were willing to put it in the public, like, Ya Rasulullah, this is what I'm dealing with. And we are willing to put in culture and to put it how people are seeing things, over the aspect of dealing with our own health, our own spiritual health, our own mental health, our own actually well-being, which we're going to be responsible in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that aspect, like, just don't do that to yourself. That's a dhulm. I consider this a dhulm to the self.
Yeah.
It's an oppression that you're doing to yourself when you are willing to stay in you and dwell in your guilt and your shame just because you don't want to address it and you don't want to look bad. You are suffering.
I mean, Allah speaks to us directly, however they used to oppress themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They would wrong themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I see people, um, not necessarily facing addictions, but I definitely see people in my office or in my work where they're very self-destructive because they feel like they're not worthy of love or they're not worthy of
Exactly.
forgiveness and mercy.
Exactly.
Let's say they're not even in addiction, but there's a behavior that they do, or there's a pattern that they get into, or there's an opinion that they have of themselves. None of it is surrounding addictions, but it's just like, I deserve misery.
Yeah.
And there are many people who are in the depths of addiction that also feel that.
That's one of
I
the
don't
key
feel that.
issues of addiction.
Yeah.
When we get into the real addiction treatment, there's a negative self-image. There's a
Yeah.
story they're saying to themselves that they deserve to hurt themselves, and that's why they stay in their addiction.
Yeah. And it's all just another excuse.
It's
At the
because
end
it's
of the
more
day,
comfortable.
it yeah, it because in order to overcome battles like this in any of our private lives, we're gonna have to face our demons. And sometimes our demons are ourselves, and we're gonna have to really come to terms with a lot of things, and we're gonna have to approach Allah sometimes in a way that we don't even want to see ourselves.
True.
We're going to approach Allah very, very humbly and in a way where we are very vulnerable and weak. And sometimes people never want to approach Allah that way. There's been plenty of examples where, not a lot, but there have been several where people come to me with spiritual questions about, or questions of theology, and a frustration that they might have trying to understand Allah, trying to understand Islam, trying to have a spiritual experience. But their frustration or their question really lies in a frustration that they have with another battle somewhere else.
Exactly.
And it's like sometimes I'm like, are we really talking about what we're talking about, or are we talking about something else? And they're like, what do you mean, Sheikh? I'm like, what are you talking about really? Like, I'm talking about what I asked you about. I'm like, it doesn't feel like it. It feels like there's a frustration somewhere else, and and there's something here out of the frame, and you're over here pretending like this is our problem. And I've had people who've embraced that, and they start talking to me about it, and I have other people who've run away. They're like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, Sheikh. I'm just like,
My teachers used to say that sexual sins manifest in these theological questions.
I think all do.
I'm not saying all the time that any theological question comes from there, but that's how they manifest.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Because that sounds theoretical, I think.
Okay, let's say someone is talking about, Sheikh, my du'as are weak, my connection in salah is suffering, I don't really understand how I'm supposed to connect better to Allah, I feel like my rizq is being interrupted, the blessing of my time is being wasted. A variety of spiritual issues, or even, yeah, Allah, I really don't understand evil in the world and suffering and temptation and sin. Why is Allah doing this to us, and why would Allah create this way? A variety of issues that they'll poke and prod at, seeking understanding. But the more and more they talk about it, the more and more like personal. There seems to be something a lot more personal right there, and they don't want to talk about it. It doesn't seem. They come to you like it's a theoretical question, like that they want to just get into some discourse about, how did Imam al-Ghazali answer this? And how did Fakhruddin al-Razi answer this? And I wonder what that tea conversation would be like if they ever discussed it, together. I'm like, I don't think you really care about that. It's kind of like a gut reaction that I feel like over experience you just get exposed to. And I'm sure Archie has plenty of that. And he's like, yeah, we're not talking about apples. We're talking about pineapples.
People are always trying to globalize their worldview when they don't want to look at their individual problem.
Yeah, and like it's. I'll even say this: the last 8 to 9 months, Gaza has made people a lot more honest. So many young men, so many people in the community are like, my salah has been weak, and I feel ashamed that it took Gaza to wake me up from my delusions and my addictions and my problems. And I'm like, what do you feel like was making your salah weak? And then they just name it. They name it. My connection to God has been lacking, not because of anything that I'm going to try to, nothing theoretical. There's something going on in my life. And I feel an extra amount of shame, guilt, and inspiration to do something.
Mm.
And it took Gaza to wake me up.
That's so
It took
interesting.
Sudan to like kind of rattle my cage and see the suffering that I'm seeing in the Muslim world, where it's like, I have no more excuses before Allah. I have no more excuses even before my own self. So it's exactly like Archie said. There's a lot of these, we try to globalize a lot of our personal stuff, but then sometimes the global world will answer right back and be like, look, you try to push it on us. Well, here Allah will show you something on the global stage that is so, I guess you say, humbling and so much of a wake up call that they kind of drop pretenses. And I'd say for the first like 6 months what was happening, what is still happening in Palestine was happening, and with Sudan, you had a lot of younger people and some older people who just,
Subhanallah. So true.
they're like, one brother even said, I need to drop all this. I want my dua to be answered.
Ya Allah.
Which is a very beautiful thing to hear.
Yeah.
I need to drop all this because I need to be an assistant, and I will assist through my dua.
MashaAllah.
I
What
mean,
you're talking
it's good
about is
that person.
the reality of death. When death becomes a
Yeah.
real possibility,
Right.
and people realize how it can happen at any time to any of us, that's when
Or our
people get
comforts.
serious. Yeah.
Or our comforts, when they see people who are just like them losing all their comforts and luxuries of life. One brother said, if what's happening in Gaza ever happens to me, how the heck am I going to function without my addictions?
Wow.
Wow. I mean, the fact that they can
When the access of it
pinpoint
is taken
and
away, right? Sorry about
yeah.
that, Sister Shada.
No, I was just saying, like, the fact that even he could pinpoint that so specifically
Exactly.
is impressive.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, I don't think they'll just cover it up, or like, like they know it might be there, but they won't admit it. But the fact that
Yeah. I
this
mean,
is uncovering these things, I mean, that's powerful.
I think most people who have addictions can pinpoint it. They're just not wanting to.
But
I
do you
think,
think that they can pinpoint the lack of their dua being answered to their addiction? That connection. Like, that's
oh,
powerful
that
that they
connection. I
said,
think I meant like the problem.
like, yeah, like, oh, my du'as are not being answered because I'm addicted. I'm doing something wrong here, and I know what I'm doing wrong, but a lot of people, I feel like, don't even make that connection that
Yeah, that is a bit more specific, and I don't come across that much where people can pinpoint like a spiritual diagnosis almost, where they're like,
yeah.
"This
I
is a
think,
blockade in my spiritual worship."
yeah, I think what you're pointing to, Shaza, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we are بَلِ الْإِنسَانُ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ بَصِيرَةٌ, right? Like a human being actually knows himself very well, but we
Yeah.
play the confused card. We basically try to be confused and not knowing why things are happening, and we can't connect the dots because we don't want to take responsibility.
Yeah,
So with things like that come, you just have to face reality, and it gives you some courage. Like it actually inspires you to, because I mean, you are aware that this is there. You just don't want to deal with it, so you kind of act confused.
and this actually ends up becoming the biggest obstacle for most people.
Exactly. Yeah.
It really does become the biggest obstacle. It's like you're trying to help, you're offering advice, you're offering consolation, you're hearing them, and then they just continue to try to lie to you and lie to themselves, more importantly, or
Yeah.
try to say, oh, it's rooted in something else. There have been times where I'm just like, okay, I've offered all that I can, and I can't even recommend you professional help because I don't want you to waste your money and I don't want you to waste their time. And I'm
So
like,
true.
let me know when you want to take this seriously. And there have been people who've had to kind of take a step back and then come back in the room. They're like, all right, I'm seriously committed to something now. And yeah, a lot of people have an issue of just not really admitting it
Yeah,
and
and I
constantly
think
creating excuses.
when it comes to dealing with addiction and treating addiction, I think, subhanAllah, the fact that we've been spending the bulk of the time addressing this particular point shows that the treatment for addiction starts with, like, the bulk of it is the admitting of it, the wanting to change it. Like, really, I usually tell people, it's just like take 90, I usually sometimes say 99% of the work. It's really that once you want, that's it. it's going to be a process because you have that want and you are clear and you acknowledged it. So I'm just so happy that you addressed it so in such a depth. The aspect of that, like, acknowledge it and confront yourself and deal with it. It's way more comfortable afterwards.
Yeah.
It's like a mountain lifted off of your chest once you put it out there and you say it for what it is and you address it and you deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's left for us. It's just like, really, now, once that any of one of us who is dealing with these kinds of things, you just put your hand on that and you say, that's it, I'm in, I want to do this. Now, what do we do? So, I mean, of course, Imam Omar, and of course, I know Archie, you're going to have a lot to add to that. Like, what are the things that we need to do when it comes to addiction? Like, when I'm ready, I'm just going to do that, especially with the sex addiction or pornography addiction.
Imam
Can you
Omar
guys give
outlined
us
it
like
perfectly.
tips?
What Imam Omar talked about before when he was just starting
Mm-hmm.
the conversation is precisely the treatment in the regular, counseling world. It's about systems and looking at what is the antecedent, what precipitates the behavior, and the only thing I
Yeah.
can add is looking at the underlying emotional component of what are you trying not to face in terms of yourself or your something about yourself.
In the realm of that, of like finding systems in your life and what's triggering you and what's leading you to these things and how to change them, it's very difficult for them to do it by themselves, but it's still very possible. It just depends on their personality and how much they can react to keeping themselves accountable. Like time management, some people are terrible at it, some people are great at it. Usually people who are good at something, of like maintaining something in their life, they can then just transfer that will into another part of their life where they then have a system or a new system to follow. For those who don't, which is I think a majority of people, I try to ask them, who in your life do you trust that you can keep yourself accountable to?
Yeah.
I'm
Exactly.
like, because I'm like, akhi, ukhti, sister, you're not going to be able to do this alone. And
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'd say that that's especially with something like sex addiction. And I think it's a beautiful thing is that I've seen married couples that have been willing to be with their spouse through that battle. And they're like, as difficult it was to them to come forward, or even those who have managed to get away without their spouse ever knowing. I'm like, do you want to stop? Do you feel that they would be able to forgive? Do you feel like they would be able to help you in this battle? If the answer is no, I'm like, all right, then who will? Is there a family friend or a family member or a friend, someone in your life? And then if their spouse is willing to go through them with them in that battle, then it's all that much more. The rates of success are a lot higher because, like, one thing I would tell people is, I'm like, a lot of people who listen to this are going to hate me for even throwing this out there, but I'm going to say it. Giving someone else that you trust access to the tools that you use to feed an addiction is probably one of the greatest things you could do. So if you're on apps where you can entertain your sexual addiction by meeting up with people, give them your password. That's like a heresy in today's world, right? Giving someone your phone password or your passwords to certain things. I'm like, dude, it's based on trust. Or let's say it's even put your location services on.
Mm-hmm.
Let your friend or your spouse know where you are at all times.
Awesome.
And be like, hey, where are you going? Oh, I'm at Whole Foods, bro. No, you're
Yeah.
not. You're not. I'm at the masjid. No, you're not. Actually, where are you going? Sister, where are you going? So having people, and I know most people will resist to that due to the discomfort. I don't know. So much stuff is going on our phones that we don't
Mm-hmm.
trust anyone with anything on our phones,
It's
right?
true.
But I think that that's probably one of the greatest ways of really, kind of speeding up that healing process and regaining control yourself, is having somebody who can share access and, you can be transparent with and accountable to, because it's very difficult to do it ourselves. And it's
Yeah.
likely that we fell into these addictions because we were alone at some point in time. You know,
Right.
that's it. Someone may have taught us, someone may have shown us, someone may have, been a part of it the first maybe time or a couple of times, but we usually face these demons very strongly when we're alone, right?
Right.
And it becomes a problem being alone.
I
Yeah.
remember one time you coached somebody to and every time somebody who wants to stop having these extramarital sex and he keeps doing it, and you ask him to do something that is like every time you do that you just pay something. If you can remind us of this, I remember that was very powerful.
Yeah, this guy was very rich. I was like, hey, every time you feed this addiction, give sadaqah. I was like, okay, fine. Fortunately for him, he was very well to do.
Who's well.
What's 20 bucks?
So
What's
maybe
100
that.
bucks?
Yeah.
And I actually got this from another teacher of mine, another coach, where he's like, introduce shame. And he actually it was literally a replica model. He told me that someone was in the same boat, and he's like, ask your friend for a loan. Don't donate anymore. Ask your friend for a loan every time you do this addiction. And there was this one guy that was like, you want me to ask so-and-so for a loan? I'm like, yeah, ask him for a loan. And he was just like, he's like, I can't do that. I'm like, you have to do it. And because like they were known as being this wealthy person, this, very accomplished,
yeah, I see
very
what you're saying.
competent. Even if they dug themselves a hole, they'll get themselves out. They relied on no one, right? Very macho personality. And I literally took this exact model from a teacher of mine who was able to teach like both like a coping mechanism and even like a spiritual lesson of muraqabah, right? Of holding yourself accountable. And he, like, I think it was like 2 tries of him committing that addiction and then having to ask someone for a loan. He's like, how much do I even ask? Like, if I ever ask a loan, it has to be for like a decent amount of money. I'm like, then ask for a decent amount of money. And he told me the first time, he was like, I asked somebody for like a $10,000 loan, and they were like, what? Omar, what's going on? Is everything okay? Are you loose? He's like, I can't answer any questions. I need $10,000. And they were just like, what's this even going to do? Like, you have businesses that are in the millions. You have, what's 10,000? Do you need more? I can ask brothers. And he was like, Akhi,
just give me the money.
like he really felt that shame. And
Yeah.
subhanAllah, this technique or this idea, I even got it from somebody else many years ago. When I came across it, I was like, wow, I heard this example. I never thought that I would be able to get to use it. And it was literally like a replicated scenario where this person 2 times is all it took. 2 times is all it took. He's like, I can't go through that shame again, of having to ask someone else for money. And I'm like, okay, now imagine the shame of having to ask someone else for help.
And Imam, you also mentioned that sometimes when you feel that you've maxed your capacity in terms of helping people, you refer them to other places. And I know there is an institute that deals with pornography that's specialized for Muslims. So if you can share with us that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, if it's porn addiction or even sex addiction, there's this beautiful resource that I've used over the years, and I've actually spoken to the founder many years ago, and I've spoken to some of the coaches. It's Purify Your Gaze. And they have like tiered levels of help. It begins with people who are going through what you're going through, and really just kind of, and anonymously, by the way, it's all anonymous. The only people that really will ever have access to your information are your therapists, and obviously there's confidentiality in that. But when you're discussing with anyone else, on forums or in chats or whatever, it's usually done anonymously. And then there's, services where it's like, if you want that one-on-one attention or you need that one-on-one attention, then obviously there's going to be some payments for it. But it's very powerful, and I've sent a lot of Muslims to that service, and I don't know of anybody who's not been able to benefit from it, and just very good reviews, mashallah.
Right.
Cool. And when I really speak of something else that I alluded to earlier, which is finding someone to help you, I just want to give a really quick anecdote about that. There was a young man who came to my office once who spoke to me about his addiction, and he spoke to me about how far it had gotten, and it had gotten very far, to a point where we're uncomfortable even discussing of how far his addiction had gotten and how much his mind had changed, how much it has really impacted even on what he found appealing. And he was deeply, deeply concerned. And I told him, does anyone know? And he actually said, yes, my father. And I was like, I would like to sit down with both of you. And he's like, okay. And the amount of, and this is, may Allah bless this family. And may Allah bless us to follow suit. The support that the father showed was the greatest catalyst that young man could have had. Of battling this addiction, holding his father's hand and getting out of it very quickly.
MashaAllah.
But it was his father's acceptance of, yes, Habibi, thank you for trusting me, but yes, this is a very big problem. And we're going to solve it together. And the bond that came out of that, the quickness of him being able to reassert control of himself and his life, was honestly something that I continuously use as an inspiration for myself, but also, on how I want to be a father the older I get, inshallah, but also on other young men and, and other families that were like, look, don't react harshly to, your son or your daughter if they come to you with an addiction. What's done is done. Now is the time for support. And,
exactly.
and this family knew that, had that lesson without me telling them. And it was very inspiring to see, to see. So I really think, after recognizing the problem, having done tawbah, one of the most beneficial things is having someone that can encourage you, someone who can help you by taking you by the hand and really offering you that encouraging word. And I just saw a very beautiful thing between that son and between that father.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, we are at time, but I just wanted to thank you again, Imam, Omar, Archie, and Nadia, even for such a, being open and honest with this conversation and being on our podcast and really having the space to discuss these issues, because these are such critical issues that, like we say, like we don't discuss and don't get a chance to shed light on and even give support or tips in the Muslim community. So again, just really wanted to thank you for holding the space for us to have this conversation that's so critical. Again, thanks everybody for joining us, and inshallah you'll tune in at our, as we continue the story with Surah Yusuf at the next Timeless Conversation episode. Jazakallahu khairan.
Wa iyyakum, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
If you like listening to our conversation about the Quran, imagine how much more you would get out of participating in a live conversation about the Quran with Dr. Nadia and a room full of people engaging with the Quran. Join us at our next in-person Seeds of Wisdom retreat, online with our weekly Quran and Me sessions, or for the youth at one of our Camp Z retreats.